They dragged Serafina Fairfax to the canyon's edge in her wedding dress, the white lace now torn and blood-stained, and threw her into the rattlesnake den because the scars on her face had convinced them she carried the devil's mark. But what happened next in that pit of vipers would prove that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Copper Ridge, Arizona Territory, as Sarah adjusted the delicate veil that covered the left side of her face for what felt like the 1,000th time that morning. Her fingers trembled not from bridal nervousness, but from the familiar weight of hiding what lay beneath that gossamer fabric bought with her last saved coins. The scars that ran from her temple down to her jawline were a map of survival, etched into her skin 3 years ago when Apache raiders had set fire to her family's ranch during the brutal summer of 1867. She had pulled her younger sister Emma from the flames that night, crawling through burning timber and collapsing beams to reach the child's bedroom, saving a life but marking herself forever with twisted flesh that pulled at her left eyelid and rope-like keloid formations that disappeared beneath her collar. The memory of that night still haunted her dreams, filled with the screams of dying horses and the acrid smell of burning hair. Emma had survived without a single burn, protected by Sarah's body as they escaped through a window into the cold desert night. But Emma was dead now anyway, taken by typhoid fever the following winter, leaving Sarah with nothing but scars and the bitter knowledge that her sacrifice had only delayed the inevitable. The Apache had been caught and hanged, but justice had felt hollow when delivered to an empty house where ghosts whispered in rooms that would never again know laughter. Today was supposed to be different. A new chapter in a story that had been written in ash and blood. Today, Garrett Whitmore, the town's most eligible bachelor and son of the territorial judge, had promised to make her his wife, despite what the gossip circles of Copper Ridge called her disfigurement. The entire population of their small frontier community would witness her transformation from the scarred spinster who lived alone in Mrs. Henderson's boarding house into a respectable married woman with a home and future. At least, that had been the plan before Garrett's mother discovered the full extent of what lay hidden beneath Sarah's carefully arranged auburn hair and strategic veiling that she had practiced positioning for hours in her cracked mirror. The trouble had started 3 days earlier when Mrs. Whitmore insisted on a private fitting with Madame Dubois, the French seamstress who had come west with dreams of establishing a respectable business among the wives of territorial officials. Sarah had reluctantly agreed to the private appointment, knowing that eventually her future mother-in-law would see the truth that makeup and clever hairstyling could only partially conceal. But when the veil slipped during the final alterations, revealing the twisted flesh that pulled at her left eyelid like melted candle wax, and the rope-like scars that disappeared beneath her collar to continue down across her shoulder and breast, Mrs. Whitmore's scream had echoed through the seamstress shop like a banshee's wail that could wake the dead. "Sweet Jesus, preserve us," the older woman had shrieked, stumbling backward and knocking over a dress form draped in half-finished silk. "My son will not be bound to a monster, to a creature marked by Satan himself." Her voice had grown sharper with each word, sharp enough to cut glass and draw blood from anyone within hearing distance. Those marks are God's punishment for some terrible sin, some unholy communion with darkness. No Christian woman bears such deformity without cause, without having trafficked with evil spirits in the desert night. Madame Dubois had tried desperately to intervene, her French accent thickening with distress as she pointed out that everyone in Copper Ridge knew exactly how Sarah had earned those scars in an act of pure heroism, risking her own life to save a child from burning death. But Mrs. Whitmore was beyond the reach of reason or compassion, consumed by a superstitious terror that seemed to transform her aristocratic features into something bestial and cruel. She had stormed from the shop like a woman possessed, leaving behind a wake of scattered pins and torn fabric, abandoning Sarah, standing half-dressed in white lace and shattered dreams that lay around her feet like broken glass. The whispers had begun immediately, spreading through Copper Ridge like wildfire through dry grass during the height of summer. Their small frontier town was the kind of place where secrets traveled faster than the weekly mail coach, and by evening, half the population had heard some version of the story that grew more horrific with each telling. The scars became more grotesque and extensive with every whispered conversation. Some claimed they covered her entire body in a web of twisted flesh. Others swore they moved in the moonlight like living serpents crawling beneath her skin. The preacher's wife, a woman given to hysterical fits and religious visions, claimed she had witnessed Sarah speaking to ravens in an ancient tongue, directing them to carry curses to her enemies. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, the blacksmith's sharp-tongued daughter who had always resented Sarah's education and relative refinement, suddenly remembered seeing strange lights emanating from the boarding house windows at midnight, and claimed she had once observed the scarred woman dancing naked in her garden during a thunderstorm, calling down lightning with gestures that belonged to no Christian ritual. The stories multiplied and evolved like living organisms, each version more fantastic and terrifying than the last, until the woman who had once been pitied as a tragic victim of circumstance was transformed into something altogether more sinister. In the collective imagination of their small community, Garrett had come to her boarding house that very night, his usually confident demeanor replaced by nervous fidgeting that made him appear younger than his 28 years. He couldn't meet her eyes as he spoke, his words falling between them, like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that disturbed everything they touched. "Sarah, my darling, my mother believes it would be best if we postponed the wedding ceremony just until this unfortunate talk dies down and people regain their Christian charity, you understand." His voice had grown quieter with each word, until she had to strain to hear him over the thundering of her own heartbeat. "People are saying terrible things, spreading vicious lies, and my father's position as territorial judge requires a certain level of respectability that we must maintain for the good of the community." She had known then, with the crushing certainty that comes with long experience of disappointment, that postponement was merely a kind word for abandonment, a gentle euphemism designed to soften a blow that would shatter her world regardless of how it was delivered. No man in Copper Ridge would risk his reputation and future prospects for a woman who carried such visible reminders of violence and loss. A woman whose very presence seemed to attract whispers and crossed fingers and protective charms. The scars that had once been badges of courage, proof of her willingness to sacrifice for those she loved, had transformed overnight into marks of shame and supernatural taint, proof that she was somehow less than whole, less than worthy of love and acceptance and the simple human dignity that others took for granted. But Sarai had gravely underestimated the depth of superstition and primitive fear that lurked beneath the veneer of Christian civilization in their frontier community. What began as cruel gossip about her physical appearance soon evolved into something far more dangerous and sinister. Old grievances and unexplained misfortunes suddenly found a convenient target in the scarred woman who lived alone and had no ultimately to defend her reputation. When the miller's prized dairy cow inexplicably went dry despite good health and adequate feed, it was because Sarah had walked past their farm on her way to gather medicinal herbs. When little Tommy Peterson developed a raging fever that left him delirious and speaking in tongues, his terrified mother swore the illness had started the very day after the boy had smiled at the scarred woman in the general store and accepted, a peppermint candy from her gloved hand. The transformation from pitied spinster to suspected witch happened with terrifying swiftness that left Sarah reeling and helpless to defend herself against accusations that grew more outlandish by the day. She found herself increasingly isolated as former acquaintances and even casual friends crossed streets to avoid her path, their faces turning away as if the mere sight of her could bring misfortune upon their households. The boarding house owner, Mrs. Henderson, a widow who had previously shown her motherly kindness, began leaving her meals outside her door rather than allowing her in the communal dining room where other guests might be contaminated by her presence. Even Dr. Morrison, the frontier physician who had originally treated her burns with such professional care and personal compassion, refused to acknowledge her when she passed him on the street, his eyes sliding away as if she had become invisible. The general store owner, Mr. Patterson, who had always been polite if distant, now watched her every movement with suspicious eyes when she came to purchase supplies, following her through the aisles as if she might steal merchandise or cast spells upon his inventory. The bank clerk counted her money twice before accepting it, handling the coins as if they might be cursed. Children who had once smiled and waved now hid behind their mothers' skirts, peeking out with frightened eyes that held none of the innocent. Curiosity of youth, but only the learned fear of adults who had filled their heads with tales of supernatural evil. It was Reverend Blackwood who finally gave voice to what the entire town had been thinking, but had lacked the courage to say aloud. Standing behind his carved wooden pulpit 3 Sundays after the cancelled wedding, the tall, cadaverous preacher declared in his booming voice that sometimes the Almighty marked certain individuals with visible signs to warn the righteous of hidden corruption that might otherwise spread undetected through a godly community. His pale blue eyes, set deep in a gaunt face that seemed carved from weathered granite, had found Sarah in the back pew where she sat alone as he spoke with passionate conviction about the biblical imperative of purging evil from their midst before it could spread like a plague among the faithful, corrupting the innocent and damning the souls of those too weak to resist temptation. The good book tells us that by their fruits ye shall know them, he thundered, his voice echoing off the simple wooden walls of their frontier church. And what fruit has this woman borne among us but misfortune and strange happenings? What blessing has her presence brought except sickness to children and barrenness to livestock? The Lord works in mysterious ways, but his warnings are clear. To those with eyes to see and hearts pure enough to understand his divine message. The congregation had turned as one to stare at Sarah, their faces a mixture of fear, disgust, and righteous anger that transformed familiar neighbors into a hostile mob, united in their determination to protect themselves from perceived supernatural threat. Sarah had felt their collective hatred wash over her like a physical force, pressing against her chest until she could barely draw breath into her lungs. The air in the small church became thick and oppressive, heavy with the weight of judgment and condemnation from people who had known her since childhood, who had watched her grow from an innocent girl into a young woman marked by tragedy but not broken by it. She had risen from her seat with as much dignity as she could muster, her spine straight and her head held high despite the trembling in her hands, and walked from the church with measured steps that echoed like gunshots in the sudden silence. She knew with absolute certainty that she would never return to that place of worship where Christian charity had been replaced by primitive fear. But leaving the church had not been enough to satisfy the growing mob mentality that gripped Copper Ridge like a fever that burned away reason and compassion. Led by the formidable Mrs. Whitmore and encouraged by Reverend Blackwood's increasingly inflammatory sermons that painted Sarah as a clear and present danger to the spiritual welfare of their community, a group of prominent citizens decided that merely shunning the scarred woman was insufficient protection for their families and businesses. They needed to take more definitive action to ensure she could never again bring her supposed supernatural curse to bear upon innocent, God-fearing people who had done nothing to deserve such persecution. The plan they hatched during secret meetings in Judge Whitmore's private study was as brutal as it was carefully calculated to appear divinely sanctioned. Rattlesnake Canyon, a deep limestone gorge located 10 miles outside town along the old Apache Trail, was known throughout. The territory to be infested with timber rattlers, coral snakes, and other venomous creatures that made it virtually impassable to human travelers. The canyon's steep walls and treacherous terrain, carved by countless flash floods over millennia, made escape virtually impossible for anyone unfortunate enough to fall into its depths. Local Apache tribes had long considered it a place of death and spiritual danger, avoiding it except for the most sacred and dangerous rituals that required communion with the spirit world. Judge Whitmore, drawing upon his extensive knowledge of biblical law and frontier justice, proclaimed that they would follow the ancient practice of trial by ordeal, allowing divine providence to determine the guilt or innocence of the accused. If Sarah was truly innocent of witchcraft, as she continued to claim, despite mounting evidence to the contrary, then surely the Lord would provide deliverance from the serpents that guarded the canyon. If she was indeed the witch they believed her to be, then justice would be served by Fang and Venom, and Copper Ridge would be cleansed of her corrupting presence forever. The other conspirators, including Sheriff Davis, who should have protected her under territorial law, nodded their agreement with the solemn gravity of men convinced they were doing God's work while simultaneously protecting their community from supernatural evil that threatened everything they held dear. They were not murderers, they told themselves, but instruments of divine will carrying out a judgment that mortal courts were ill-equipped to render. The decision was made in the early hours of dawn on what should have been Sarah's wedding day, the symbolism of the date chosen deliberately to emphasize the transformation from sacred ceremony to righteous execution. On that morning that should have marked the beginning of her new life as a married woman, Sarah awoke to the sound of heavy footsteps on the boarding house stairs, boots that struck the wooden steps with ominous purpose, rather than the casual gait of other residents going about their daily business. She had time only to throw a woolen shawl over her white cotton nightgown before her door was forced open with such violence that the brass hinges screamed in protest. Judge Whitmore stood in the doorway like an avenging angel, his imposing figure, flanked by Sheriff Davis, Blacksmith Henderson, and 4 other men she recognized as pillars of the community who had once tipped their hats respectfully when they passed her on the street. Their faces were grim but determined, bearing the expressions of men convinced they were doing unpleasant but necessary work for the greater good of civilization. They carried themselves with the righteousness of crusaders embarking upon a holy mission, their eyes holding none of the uncertainty or guilt that might have suggested they harbored doubts about the justice of their cause. These were not the faces of men acting in passion or temporary madness, but the cold resolve of individuals who had carefully considered their actions and found them not only justified, but morally imperative. Serafina Fairfax, Judge Whitmore, intoned in his formal courtroom voice, each word weighted with the full authority of territorial law and divine mandate. You stand accused of practicing witchcraft and bringing supernatural curses upon this Christian community. The evidence of your corruption is written upon your very flesh in marks that no righteous woman could bear, and your continued presence among us endangers every God-fearing soul in Copper Ridge. He paused dramatically, allowing the weight of his words to settle in the small room like dust after an explosion. We hereby banish you from this territory under the ancient laws that govern such matters. But first, you must face divine judgment for your crimes against nature and heaven. They had bound her hands with coarse hemp rope that bit into her wrists, ignoring her protests and pleas for reason that fell upon ears deafened by religious fervor and superstitious terror. The white wedding dress that had hung in her wardrobe like a symbol of hope and new beginnings was torn from its careful wrapping and forced over her nightgown like a burial shroud, the delicate lace catching on the rope burns that already marked her arms. Mrs. Whitmore had insisted on this final humiliation, her voice shrill with vindictive satisfaction as she declared that if Sarah wanted to play the part of a bride, she could meet her bridegroom in the depths of hell where all witches belonged. The journey to Rattlesnake Canyon took nearly 3 hours over rough terrain that had never known the touch of a proper road. Only game trails and Apache hunting paths that wound through stands of mesquite and palo verde trees. The wagon bounced and lurched over rocks and fallen logs, each jarring impact leaving Sarah bruised and bleeding from constant collision with the rough wooden sides. The men spoke little during the ride, their silence more ominous than any threats could have been, broken only by the occasional muttered prayer or biblical quotation that seemed designed more to reassure themselves than to invoke divine blessing. When they finally reached the canyon's rim, the morning sun had climbed high enough to reveal the full horror of what lay below in stark detail that made Sarah's blood freeze in her veins. The gorge dropped nearly 100 feet into a labyrinthine maze of house-sized boulders, separated by narrow passages that disappeared into shadow. The walls were layered limestone carved into fantastic formations by millennia of flash floods, creating countless crevices and caves that could shelter any number of venomous creatures. Even from the rim, Sarah could see the telltale movement of serpents basking on sun-warmed stones, their diamond-patterned scales glittering like jewels. In the harsh desert light, the dry air carried the distinctive musty scent of snake dens, mixed with the dusty smell of calcified bone and the sweet corruption of things that had died in places where scavengers could not reach them. Somewhere in the depths below, she could hear the warning rattle that gave the canyon its name, a sound like dried beans in a gourd that spoke of death coiled and ready to strike. Vultures circled overhead in lazy spirals, their keen eyes already assessing the potential for fresh carrion that would soon be available for their consumption. Judge Whitmore had produced a leather-bound family Bible, its pages yellowed with age and marked with countless readings, and began reciting from Deuteronomy about the punishment of witches and the divine imperative of purging evil from among the righteous. His voice echoed off the canyon walls as he spoke of fire and brimstone, of divine judgment upon those who trafficked with darkness and brought corruption into the midst of God's chosen people. The other men stood in a solemn semicircle around Sarah, their hands resting on gun butts and coiled rope, ready to prevent any desperate attempt at escape that might deny divine justice its proper course. Let the Lord's own creatures judge whether you bear his mark of righteousness or Satan's brand of corruption, the judge had declared as he closed the holy book with ceremonial finality. If you are innocent as you claim before man and God, then he will surely provide deliverance from the serpents that guard this place of judgment. If you are indeed the witch we know you to be, then justice will be served by fang and venom, and our community will be cleansed of your unholy presence forever. His words carried the weight of absolute conviction, the unshakable certainty of a man who had never questioned his own righteousness or considered that he might be capable of monstrous error. They had cut her bonds only long enough to tear away her woolen shawl and force her arms into the sleeves of the wedding dress, transforming her from accused criminal into sacrificial offering with ritualistic precision. The symbolism was not lost on Sarah as they dressed her like a pagan bride, being prepared for immolation. The white lace and satin, a cruel mockery of everything the garment was meant to represent: love, hope, new beginnings, the blessing of family. and community upon a union sanctioned by God and man. Mrs. Whitmore had even woven a crown of desert flowers around a framework of thorns, placing it upon Sarah's head with ceremonial gravity, while the sharp points drew blood from her scalp that trickled down her face like crimson tears. The actual moment of being cast into the canyon happened with shocking swiftness that left no time for final prayers or last words. One moment Sarah stood on solid ground, pleading desperately for mercy and reason from men who had known her since childhood, and the next she was tumbling through empty air with nothing but death waiting. Below, the wedding dress billowed around her like broken wings, the white fabric streaming behind her in a mockery of angelic flight as gravity claimed her body and pulled her inexorably toward the maze of rocks and serpents that would serve as her tomb. The world spun in a kaleidoscope of blue sky, red canyon walls, and green desert vegetation as she fell through space that seemed to stretch forever. Time dilated strangely, each second feeling like an hour as her mind processed the absolute certainty that she was about to die in the most horrible way imaginable, torn apart by fangs and venom in a place where no one would ever find her bones. The air rushing past her ears created a sound like screaming wind, drowning out her own voice as she called out to a god who seemed to have abandoned her to the mercy of men who possessed none. She landed hard on a narrow ledge halfway down the canyon wall, the impact driving every molecule of air from her lungs and sending waves of agony through her already battered body. The wedding dress had torn in multiple places during the fall, leaving her legs and arms exposed to the thorns and razor-sharp rocks that surrounded her precarious perch like the teeth of some geological monster. Blood seeped from dozens of small wounds, and she could taste copper in her mouth where she had bitten her tongue hard enough to puncture the flesh. Her left shoulder felt wrong, probably dislocated, and her ribs screamed with each attempt to breathe. Above her, the faces of her accusers appeared at the canyon rim like vultures waiting patiently for death to finish its work. Judge Whitmore called down to her in his booming courtroom voice, telling her to make peace with whatever God would have her soul, because no mortal help would come to this place of divine judgment. The other men nodded in solemn agreement, satisfied that justice had been served according to the ancient laws, and that Copper Ridge was now safe from her supposed supernatural influence. They would return to town as heroes, protectors of the innocent, instruments of divine will who had risked their own souls to save their community. As their footsteps retreated and the sound of wagon wheels faded into the distance, Sarah found herself truly alone for the first time in her 24 years of life. The silence of the canyon was broken only by the whisper of wind through stone formations carved into fantastic shapes by countless years of erosion, and the occasional dry rattle that reminded her she was far from safe despite having survived the fall. The sun climbed higher in the cloudless sky, and she realized with growing despair that even if she somehow managed to avoid the serpents, the brutal desert heat and complete lack of water would likely kill her within days. But Serafina Fairfax had not lived through Apache raids and house fires by surrendering to despair when faced with seemingly impossible odds. She examined her situation with the same practical mind that had helped her rebuild her life after losing everything she held dear, forcing herself to think clearly, despite the pain that radiated from every part of her body. The ledge was perhaps 6 feet wide and extended around a curve in the canyon wall where she could not see what lay beyond. If she could find a way down to the canyon floor, there might be water somewhere in the maze of rocks and vegetation below, trapped in stone basins by the flash floods that periodically scoured these depths. The descent would be treacherous in a torn wedding dress and bare feet that were already cut and bleeding from her impact with the rocky ledge. But staying where she was meant certain death from exposure, and she had not survived this long by choosing the easy path when faced with impossible choices. She began working her way along the narrow shelf of limestone, testing each handhold and footstep carefully before committing her full weight to any surface that might crumble under pressure. The stone was sharp against her palms, slicing into flesh already tender from rope burns, and more than once, loose fragments tumbled into the depths below, their echoing impacts a constant reminder of what awaited any misstep. It was during this painstaking descent that she heard the first rattle directly behind her, so close she could feel the vibration through the stone beneath her hands. She froze completely, not daring to turn around or make any sudden movement, as the warning sound continued for what seemed like hours, but was probably only seconds. When silence finally returned, she forced herself to continue moving downward, knowing that staying motionless was not an option that would preserve her life any longer than movement would. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rattlesnake that had given its warning was coiled on a sun-warmed section of the ledge she had just traversed, its massive body easily 6 feet long and thick as her forearm. The timber rattler's diamond-patterned scales gleamed like polished jewels in the harsh sunlight, and its triangular head swayed slightly as it tracked her movement with unblinking eyes that held no mercy or emotion, only the cold calculation of a perfect predator. The snake showed no immediate inclination to strike, content for the moment to bask in the warmth while keeping its prey under observation, but it effectively blocked any retreat back the way she had come. Sarah continued her careful descent, the ruined wedding dress now more hindrance than protection, as it caught on every thorn bush and rocky projection that lined the canyon wall. She was forced to tear away large sections of the silk and lace skirt to free herself from entanglements that could prove fatal if they caused her to lose her grip on the treacherous stone face. Each piece of white fabric she discarded fluttered away in the desert breeze like prayer flags or surrender banners, and she felt as though she was shedding not just cloth, but the last remnants of her former life as a woman who had once believed in the possibility of love and acceptance among civilized people. The canyon floor, when she finally reached it after what felt like an eternity of careful climbing, proved to be a labyrinthine maze of house-sized boulders separated by narrow passages barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through sideways. The air was noticeably cooler here, shaded by the towering walls that rose on all sides like the ramparts of some ancient fortress. But it also carried the musty scent of snake dens much more strongly than it had on the upper ledges. Every shadow could conceal a coiled serpent. Every crevice could hide death, waiting in patient stillness for the unwary to stumble within striking range. She had been exploring this geological maze for perhaps an hour, following what seemed like ancient watercourses carved into the stone by millennia of flash floods, when she heard the distinct sound of water dripping somewhere ahead in the labyrinth. Following the precious sound through increasingly narrow passages that scraped against her torn dress and lacerated skin, she finally emerged into a small, circular clearing where a natural spring bubbled up from some underground source, creating a pool of crystal-clear water no larger than a wagon wheel. Desert flowers bloomed around its edges in impossible profusion, their bright colors a startling contrast to the harsh landscape, and she could see the tracks of various animals pressed into the soft earth: deer, rabbits, even the paw prints of what might have been a mountain lion. It was while she knelt beside this miraculous spring, cupping the precious water in her bloodied hands and drinking deeply for the first time since her ordeal began, that she heard the rattle that would change everything. This time, the warning came from directly above her position, where a coral snake had apparently been disturbed from its resting place on a rock overhang that provided shade during the hottest part of the day. Unlike the timber rattler on the ledge above, This smaller but infinitely more venomous serpent showed immediate aggressive intent, its compact body coiling for a strike that would deliver enough neurotoxin to kill a full-grown man in a matter of minutes. The coral snake dropped from its rocky perch like a striking hawk, its brilliantly banded body aimed directly at her exposed neck, where the torn wedding dress offered no protection whatsoever. Time seemed to slow as Sarah watched death descend toward her in the form of two needle-sharp fangs, dripping with venom that could paralyze her nervous system before she had time to scream. She raised her hands instinctively in a futile gesture of protection, but knew she was too slow to deflect an attack launched from such close range with such deadly precision. That was the moment when Firewolf appeared, materializing from the shadows like a spirit of the desert itself. Firewolf moved like lightning made flesh, his weathered hand shooting out to catch the coral snake mere inches from Sarah's throat, his fingers closing around the serpent's body with the practiced precision of a man who had been hunting venomous creatures since childhood. The snake writhed furiously in his grip, its fangs snapping at empty air, while drops of deadly venom scattered like poisonous rain across the rocky ground. Without hesitation, he flung the creature away into the depths of the canyon, where it landed with a distant thud among the boulders, alive but no longer a threat to the terrified woman who knelt frozen beside the spring. For a moment that stretched like eternity, neither of them moved or spoke. Sarah stared up at her unexpected savior through eyes wide with shock and disbelief, taking in details that seemed too extraordinary to be real. Firewolf stood nearly 7 feet tall, his powerful frame draped in traditional Yurok hunting garments, made from elk hide and decorated with intricate beadwork that caught the filtered sunlight streaming down through the canyon walls. His long black hair was braided with eagle feathers and strips of red cloth, and his face bore the ritual tattoos of his tribe, geometric patterns that marked him as a master tracker and healer among his people. His most striking feature, however, was his eyes, which seemed to hold the wisdom of ancient mountains and the patience of flowing rivers. They were dark as obsidian, but warm, with an inner light that spoke of compassion earned through suffering, of strength tempered by understanding. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep and resonant, carrying the musical cadence of his native tongue, even when forming English words learned from traders and missionaries who had ventured into Yurok territory over the years. "You are not meant to die in this place of serpents," he said simply, extending a hand toward her with the same unhurried grace that had characterized his rescue of her from the coral snake. "The spirits whispered of a woman cast down by those who fear what they do not understand. They told me to come quickly, for her heart still beats with the rhythm of justice, and justice must not perish in darkness." His words carried weight, beyond their literal meaning, as if he spoke not just of her immediate physical danger, but of something deeper and more fundamental. Sarah found her voice after several attempts, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper roughened by dust and terror. "Who are you? How did you know I was here?" She accepted his offered hand and allowed him to help her stand, noting the careful way he avoided looking directly at the scars that marked the left side of her face. Unlike the people of Copper Ridge, who had stared at her disfigurement with mixture of fascination and revulsion, this stranger seemed to see past her physical marks to something else entirely. "I am called Firewolf by your people, though my true name in the tongue of my ancestors is Nekweka, which means one who carries the flame of healing," he replied, his hands moving in quick, efficient gestures to examine her injuries without touching her inappropriately. "I was hunting deer in the high country when the eagles brought word of great injustice being done, of innocent blood being shed by those who claim to follow the teachings of peace. The wind itself carried your cries to my ears, and I came as quickly as the mountain paths would allow." As he spoke, Firewolf was already removing items from a leather pouch worn across his shoulder, producing small bundles of herbs, strips of clean buckskin, and a carved bone needle that gleamed white as fresh snow. His movements were economical and practiced, those of a man who had treated countless injuries in places where proper medical attention was nothing but a distant hope. He gestured toward a flat boulder near the spring, indicating that she should sit while he prepared medicines that would ease her pain and prevent infection in her numerous wounds. "Your people threw you here to die, believing you cursed by evil spirits," he continued, his tone matter-of-fact rather than accusatory. "But the Yurok have walked these lands for thousands of seasons, and we know the difference between true darkness and the marks left by courage. Those scars you bear are not signs of corruption. They are proof that you have faced fire and emerged. With your spirit intact, only the bravest souls carry such marks, for only they are willing to sacrifice their own flesh to save another." While he spoke, Firewolf began cleaning her wounds with water from the sacred spring, his touch as gentle as a mother tending her child despite the obvious strength in his hands. Each cut and abrasion received careful attention, and Sarah found herself marveling at the difference between his ministrations and the rough handling she had received from the men of Copper Ridge. Here was someone who treated her body as something precious rather than contaminated, someone who saw her injuries as requiring healing rather than punishment. "The coral snake that nearly took your life carries venom that kills by stopping the breath," Firewolf explained as he worked, his voice taking on the rhythmic quality of a teacher sharing ancient knowledge. "But its bite also carries medicine for those who know how to extract it properly. The Yurok have used serpent venom for generations to treat certain illnesses, always with great ceremony and respect for the creatures that provide such powerful gifts. What your people see as instruments of divine judgment, we understand as part of the great balance that governs all living things." As he cleaned and bandaged her wounds, Firewolf told her stories of his people's relationship with the natural world, tales that painted a picture of existence far different from the harsh judgments and supernatural fears that dominated life in Copper Ridge. In the Yurok way of understanding, every creature had its place and purpose, even the venomous serpents that inhabited places like Rattlesnake Canyon. Death and life were not opposing forces, but partners in an eternal dance that created the conditions necessary for all existence to flourish. My grandmother, who possessed the gift of seeing beyond the veil between worlds, told me many seasons ago that I would one day meet a woman marked by fire who would need my help to find her true path, he continued, applying a poultice made from crushed herbs to a particularly deep cut on her forearm. She said this woman would be cast out by her own people for carrying the proof of her courage upon her skin, and that helping her would be part of my own journey toward understanding the great mystery that connects all living things. The medicine Firewolf applied to her wounds worked with remarkable speed, numbing the pain that had been her constant companion since the fall into the canyon. The herbs carried a pleasant, earthy scent that reminded her of rain on desert soil, and she felt tension leaving her muscles for the first time in days. More than the physical relief, however, was the emotional balm of being treated with kindness and respect by someone who expected nothing in return except the opportunity to ease suffering. "The men who cast you down here believe they served justice," Firewolf said, his voice growing more serious as he worked on cleaning the cuts left by the crown of thorns that had adorned her head during the mock wedding ceremony. "But true justice does not require the suffering of innocence to prove its power. True justice seeks to heal what has been broken, to restore balance where chaos has taken root, to protect those who cannot protect themselves from the cruelty of others. What they did to you was not justice. It was fear wearing the mask of righteousness." As the afternoon progressed and Firewolf continued his careful treatment of her injuries, Sarah found herself telling him the full story of her ordeal, beginning with the fire that had scarred her face and continuing through the cancelled wedding and the accusations of witchcraft that had led to her being cast into the canyon. She had never spoken so openly about her experiences to anyone, but something about Firewolf's presence made honesty feel not only safe, but necessary. He listened without interruption, his dark eyes reflecting understanding and compassion, as she described the transformation from respected member of the community to feared outcast. When she finished her tale, he was quiet for a long moment, his hands still working to bind her wounds with strips of soft buckskin that would protect them from further injury while allowing proper healing to occur. Among the Yurok, we have a saying that translates roughly as, "The wounded healer carries the deepest medicine," he finally said, his voice carrying the weight of ancient wisdom passed down through countless generations. Those who have survived great trials and emerged with their compassion intact possess a power that those who have never suffered cannot understand. Your scars make you not cursed, but blessed with the ability to recognize and ease the pain of others who walk similar paths. Firewolf produced a small mirror made from polished obsidian and held it so that Sarah could see her reflection for the first time since being cast into the canyon. What looked back at her was not the monster that the people of Copper Ridge had made her believe she had become, but a woman whose face told a story of courage and survival. The scars were still there, of course, but seen in the context of Firewolf's words and reflected in the volcanic glass sacred to his people, they appeared not as marks of shame, but as badges of honor, earned through selfless sacrifice. The poison your former people poured into your spirit with their words and actions is more dangerous than any snake venom, he continued, carefully wrapping the obsidian mirror in soft cloth before returning it to his pouch. It seeps into the soul slowly, convincing its victim that the cruelty of others is somehow deserved, that isolation and rejection are natural consequences of being different. But I tell you now, with the authority of one who speaks for the spirits of this sacred canyon, you were never the monster they believed you to be. As the sun began its descent toward the western rim of the canyon, Firewolf built a small fire using techniques that created almost no smoke, explaining that while they were relatively safe in this hidden corner of the gorge, it was wise not to advertise their presence to anyone who might be watching from above. The flames danced cheerfully in the gathering dusk, their warm light creating a circle of comfort and safety in the midst of what had been a place of terror and despair only hours earlier. Tonight, you will rest and allow your body to begin. In proper healing, Firewolf announced, producing strips of dried venison and cakes made from acorn meal that would provide nourishment for her weakened system. Tomorrow, when your strength has returned sufficiently, we will discuss what path your feet should follow now that the old path has been blocked by those too blind to recognize your true worth. The Yurok have walked many different trails through the mountains and valleys of this land, and some of them lead to places where scars are seen as signs of wisdom rather than marks of corruption. The food Firewolf offered was unlike anything Sarah had ever tasted, seasoned with herbs that seemed to carry the essence of the high country where his people made their homes. Each bite brought renewed strength to her battered body, and she found herself eating with an appetite that had been absent for weeks. The simple act of sharing a meal with someone who treated her as a fellow human being rather than a dangerous aberration felt like a miracle more profound than any biblical story she had heard preached from pulpits. The coral snake that nearly claimed your life today was not sent by any evil force, Firewolf explained as they ate, his voice taking on the cadence of traditional storytelling. It was simply a creature following its nature, defending what it perceived as its territory from an intruder. The real evil lies in the hearts of those who cast you down here, who allowed fear and superstition to overcome their capacity for Christian mercy and human understanding. They are the ones who carry poison in their souls, not you. As full darkness settled over the canyon and stars began to appear in the narrow strip of sky, visible between the towering walls, Firewolf began preparing a sleeping area for Sarah using soft grasses and his own elk hide blanket. His movements were those of someone accustomed to caring for others, and she realized that this stranger was showing her more genuine kindness than she had received from people who had known her since childhood. "Sleep now without fear, Fire," Wolf said, settling himself on the opposite side of the small fire where he could watch the various entrances to their sheltered alcove. "I will keep watch through the night, for this canyon holds many dangers beyond serpents, but know that you are under the protection of one who has sworn before the spirits of his ancestors to see you safely through this trial. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, but also new possibilities that your former life could never have offered." Despite everything she had endured, Sarah found herself able to sleep deeply for the first time in weeks, lulled by the gentle crackle of the fire and the reassuring presence of her unlikely guardian. Her dreams were filled not with the nightmares that had plagued her since the accusations of witchcraft began, but with visions of mountain streams and ancient forests where scarred women were welcomed as bearers of hard-won wisdom rather than feared as carriers of supernatural corruption. Firewolf kept his vigil through the long night, feeding the fire just enough to maintain warmth without creating a beacon that might attract unwanted attention. Several times he heard the movements of various creatures in the darkness beyond their sanctuary, the soft padding of coyotes, the flutter of bats emerging to hunt, and once the distinctive rattle that announced the presence of one of the canyon's more dangerous inhabitants. But nothing approached close enough to threaten the sleeping woman who had been entrusted to his care by forces greater than human understanding. When dawn began to paint the eastern rim of the canyon with shades of gold and crimson, Firewolf quietly prepared a breakfast of herbal tea and dried fruits while Sarah continued to sleep the healing sleep of one whose burdens had finally been shared with someone capable of bearing part of their weight. He studied her peaceful face in the growing light, noting how different she appeared when not carrying the constant tension of fear and rejection. Here was a soul that had been tested by fire and had emerged not broken but transformed, though she did not yet fully understand the nature of her own transformation. The sound of his movements finally woke her as the sun crested the canyon rim and sent shafts of golden light down into their hidden sanctuary. For a moment she seemed confused, as if unsure whether her rescue had been real or merely another cruel dream sent to torment her in her extremity. But when she saw Firewolf's reassuring smile and smelled the fragrant tea he had prepared for her, she knew that she had indeed found salvation in the most unlikely of places. "Good morning, Sister of the Scars," Firewolf said, using a term of address that in his culture denoted great respect for those who had endured significant trials. "Your color is much improved, and I can see that the healing has begun, not just in your wounds, but in your spirit as well. Today, we must decide what direction your path will take now that you have been freed from the chains of others' expectations and fears." 3 days had passed since Firewolf had pulled Sarah from the jaws of death in Rattlesnake Canyon, and during that time she had witnessed transformations in herself that seemed impossible just a week earlier. Her physical wounds were healing with remarkable speed under his expert care, but more significantly, the deep spiritual poison that had been injected into her soul by months of cruelty and rejection was beginning to drain away like infected matter from a lanced wound. Each morning brought renewed strength, and each evening found her more capable of looking at her reflection in Firewolf's obsidian mirror without flinching at what she saw there. On this particular morning, as golden sunlight filtered down through the canyon walls and painted their hidden sanctuary in shades of amber and rose, Firewolf announced that it was time for her to learn the true reason why the spirits had guided him to find her in this place of serpents and stone. He had been preparing for this conversation since the moment he first saw her, recognizing signs and portents that spoke to mysteries far deeper than simple rescue from immediate physical danger. "There is something you must know about the nature of your scars and why they have brought such fear to the hearts of your former people," Firewolf began, his voice carrying the weight of revelations that would reshape her understanding of everything she had endured. "Among the Yurok, we have ancient stories passed down through countless generations about women marked by fire who carry within them the power to heal not just individual wounds, but the sickness that can infect entire communities when fear and hatred are allowed to fester unchecked." Sarah listened with growing amazement as Firewolf recounted legends that seemed to describe her own experience with uncanny accuracy. The stories spoke of women who would be rejected by their birth communities because of visible marks that others interpreted as signs of corruption or supernatural taint. These women, according to Yurok tradition, were destined to undergo trials that would either destroy them or transform them into powerful healers, capable of bridging the gap between different worlds and ways of understanding. "The fire that marked your face was not punishment from any angry god," Firewolf continued, his dark eyes reflecting absolute conviction in the truth of what he spoke. "It was initiation into a role that your soul accepted before you were born into this lifetime. The courage you showed in saving your sister was merely the first test, and everything that has happened since, the rejection, the accusations, even being cast into this canyon, all of it has been preparation for the work you are meant to do in this world." The concept was so foreign to everything Sarah had been taught about divine will and human suffering that she initially struggled to accept Firewolf's interpretation of her experiences. The Christian worldview of her upbringing had taught her to see her scars as either random misfortune or possible punishment for unnamed sins, never as marks of divine selection for a specific purpose. But as Firewolf continued to share the wisdom of his people, she began to recognize patterns in her own life that she had previously dismissed as mere coincidence. "Even before the fire changed your appearance, you possessed gifts that others could sense but not understand." "Fire," Wolf observed, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of traditional teaching. "You could calm frightened animals with your touch, help plants grow more abundantly in your garden, and people often sought you out when they needed comfort during times of loss or distress. These abilities frightened some because they suggested connections to forces beyond normal human understanding, but to the Yurok, such gifts are recognized as signs of a soul chosen for special service." As Firewolf spoke, memories flooded back to Sarah of incidents she had forgotten or dismissed as unimportant. The injured hawk she had nursed back to health when she was 12, which had followed her around like a pet for months afterward. The way her presence seemed to ease the pain of women in childbirth, leading several to request specifically that she attend their deliveries. The uncanny ability she had always possessed to find lost objects or missing livestock, as if some inner compass guided her steps toward whatever had gone astray. "The scars you bear are not disfigurement, but sacred tattoos burned into your flesh by forces that work beyond human understanding," Firewolf explained, gently touching the twisted skin along her jawline with reverence rather than revulsion. "In many indigenous traditions, ritual scarification is used to mark those who have successfully completed important spiritual initiations. Your scars tell the same story. They announce to anyone with wisdom to read their meaning that you have passed through fire and emerged transformed rather than destroyed." Firewolf then shared something that would forever change how Sarah understood her place in the world. He told her that he himself had been searching for her for nearly 2 years, guided by visions received during sacred ceremonies performed in the high mountain meadows where his people gathered to commune with the spirits of their ancestors. The visions had shown him a woman marked by fire, who would play a crucial role in preventing a great conflict that threatened to engulf the entire territory in violence and bloodshed. The tensions between my people and the white settlers grow, stronger with each passing season, Firewolf explained, his expression growing grave as he contemplated the challenges that lay ahead. There are leaders on both sides who seek war as the solution to the problems created by competing claims to the same lands and resources. But the spirits have shown me that another path exists, one that requires a bridge builder who can speak to the fears and hopes of both peoples because she has experienced rejection and acceptance from each. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. The revelation that her suffering had a purpose beyond her own spiritual development filled Sarah with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The idea that she might be called to play a role in preventing bloodshed between different peoples was both inspiring and terrifying, especially given her recent experience with how quickly fear could transform ordinary humans into violent mobs. But Firewolf's quiet confidence in her abilities began to awaken something within her that had been dormant since childhood, a sense of destiny that she had long suppressed out of practical necessity. But first, you must complete your own healing and learn the skills you will need to fulfill this calling, Firewolf continued, his voice reassuring despite the magnitude of what he was suggesting. The Yurok elders have agreed to welcome you into our tribe as an adopted daughter, if you choose to accept such an honor. You would live among us for a full cycle of seasons, learning our ways of healing and peacekeeping, studying the arts of diplomacy and spiritual healing that will be necessary for the work ahead. The offer to join Firewolf's people represented a complete transformation of everything Sarah had believed about her future possibilities. Instead of living as a scorned outcast on the margins of white society, she would be welcomed into a community that valued her scars as marks of honor rather than shame. Instead of hiding her unusual abilities, she would be trained to develop and use them in service of something greater than her own survival and comfort. Why would your people accept someone like me? Sarah asked, still struggling to believe that any community would willingly embrace a woman who had been branded as cursed and dangerous by her own kind. How can you be certain they will see me as you do, rather than as the monster that others have named me? The question revealed the depth of damage done to her self-perception by months of systematic rejection and demonization. Firewolf's response came in the form of a story about his own past that he had never shared with any white person before this moment. He told her about his wife, Bright Star, who had been killed 3 years earlier, not by disease or accident, but by white soldiers who had mistaken her for a hostile warrior because of ritual scars covering her arms and chest. The scars had been applied during ceremonies marking her status as a spiritual leader among the women of their tribe, but the soldiers had interpreted them as evidence of savage brutality and had shot her down without warning or provocation. I understand what it means to watch fear and ignorance destroy someone whose only crime was carrying visible proof of a different way of understanding the world, Firewolf said, his voice heavy with grief that time had not diminished. Bright Star died because men trained to see enemies everywhere could not recognize a healer when she stood before them offering medicine for their wounded. I have spent these 3 years learning to transform my anger into something more useful. The determination to prevent such tragedies from happening again. The parallel between Firewolf's loss and Sarah's persecution created an immediate bond of understanding between them that transcended the differences in their backgrounds and cultures. Both had experienced the devastating consequences of fear-based judgment, and both carried scars, his invisible but no less real, that marked them as survivors of humanity's capacity for cruel misunderstanding. This shared experience of loss and rejection formed the foundation for a partnership that would prove stronger than either could have imagined. Among my people, it is believed that the spirits sometimes bring together those who have suffered similar wounds so that their combined strength can accomplish what neither could achieve alone, Firewolf explained, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that spoke of possibilities she was only beginning to comprehend. Your scars and mine, the visible and the hidden, make us uniquely qualified to understand the pain that drives people to commit acts of cruelty against those who are different from themselves. This understanding is the first step toward creating the healing that both our peoples desperately need. As they talked through the morning and into the afternoon, Firewolf began teaching Sarah techniques for reading the subtle signs that indicated a person's emotional and spiritual condition. He showed her how to recognize the physical manifestations of fear, anger, guilt, and other emotions that could drive individuals or groups toward destructive behavior. These skills, he explained, would be essential for her future role as a mediator between communities that had lost the ability to see each other as fellow human beings, deserving of respect and compassion. The same fear that caused your people to cast you into this canyon drives many of the conflicts between whites and indigenous peoples, Firewolf observed as he demonstrated how to prepare medicinal teas that could calm anxiety and reduce aggressive impulses. Fear of the unknown, fear of losing what one already possesses, fear that accepting differences might somehow diminish one's own identity or security. But fear can be transformed into understanding when people are given safe opportunities to encounter what they have been taught to dread. The lessons Firewolf shared went far beyond simple herbal remedies and basic healing techniques. He taught her about the psychological principles that governed human behavior in times of crisis, explaining how communities under stress often sought scapegoats to blame for their problems, rather than examining the real causes of their difficulties. This knowledge helped Sarah understand that the persecution she had endured was not really about her individual actions or appearance, but about Copper Ridge's collective need to find someone onto whom they could project their fears about drought, economic hardship, and the uncertain future of their frontier settlement. You became a symbol of everything they feared about the uncontrollable forces that threatened their sense of security and order, Firewolf explained as he taught her meditation techniques designed to maintain inner calm in the face of external chaos. Your scars reminded them that terrible things could happen to anyone, that their own safety was not guaranteed by good behavior or religious devotion. Rather than face these uncomfortable truths about the nature of existence, they chose to believe that you had somehow brought misfortune upon yourself, and that banishing you would restore their sense of control over their circumstances. This deeper understanding of the psychological forces that had driven her persecution allowed Sarah to begin releasing the personal hatred and desire for revenge that had been poisoning her spirit since the day she was thrown into the canyon. Instead of seeing the people of Copper Ridge as irredeemably evil, she began to understand them as frightened individuals who had made terrible choices because they lacked the tools necessary to cope with uncertainty and change in healthier ways. Fire. Wolf also shared stories of successful peacekeeping efforts from his own experience, describing situations where he had helped resolve conflicts between different tribal groups or between indigenous peoples and white settlers. These stories illustrated the practical application of the principles he was teaching, showing how understanding and compassion could be used strategically to diffuse tensions and create opportunities for mutual cooperation rather than destructive competition. The most important lesson I can teach you is that healing work requires great patience and the ability to see beyond immediate circumstances to longer-term possibilities, Firewolf said, as evening approached and they prepared to share another meal beside their small fire. People who have been trained to fear and hate do not change their attitudes overnight, even when presented with compelling evidence that their beliefs are inaccurate. True healing happens gradually, through repeated positive experiences that slowly override the negative programming they have received. As the stars emerged overhead and the canyon walls glowed with reflected firelight, Sarah found herself contemplating a future that would have been unimaginable just days earlier. Instead of living as a bitter exile, consumed by hatred for those who had wronged her, she was being offered the opportunity to transform her suffering into a source of strength that could benefit both her former tormentors and their intended victims. The prospect was both thrilling and daunting, requiring her to expand her sense of personal identity beyond anything she had previously considered possible. Tomorrow, we begin the journey to my people's village in the high country, Firewolf announced as they settled down for the night. It will take us 4 days of hard travel through mountain passes that few white people have ever seen. But at the end of that journey, you will find a community prepared to welcome you, not as a refugee seeking charity, but as a future leader whose unique experiences have prepared her for important work that no one else can do. Are you ready to leave behind the woman you were and embrace the woman you are meant to become? Basara's answer came without hesitation, spoken with a conviction that surprised her with its strength and clarity. Yes, she said simply, but the single word carried the weight of a sacred vow that would reshape not only her own destiny, but the fate of everyone whose lives she would touch in the years to come. The scarred bride who had been cast into Rattlesnake Canyon to die was gone forever, replaced by someone whose true journey was only just beginning. That night, as Firewolf kept his usual vigilant watch and Sarah slept deeply under a canopy of desert stars, both of them understood that they stood at the threshold of something unprecedented in the violent history of their troubled territory. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of an alliance between two wounded souls whose combined wisdom and determination would prove more powerful than all the fear and hatred that had previously shaped the relationship between their respective peoples. The serpents of Rattlesnake Canyon had failed to claim their intended victim, but in doing so, they had inadvertently given birth to something far more dangerous to those who profited from division and conflict. Hope for a different kind of future built on understanding rather than domination. The journey through the mountain passes to reach Firewolf's village proved to be far more than a simple change of location. It became a pilgrimage of profound personal transformation that stripped away the last remnants of Sarah's former identity and rebuilt her from the ground up as someone entirely new. The first day of travel took them along ancient deer paths that wound through stands of towering ponderosa pines and across meadows carpeted with wildflowers that seemed to glow with their own inner light in the thin mountain air. Firewolf set a pace that challenged Sarah's still recovering strength without pushing her beyond her limits, stopping frequently to point out medicinal plants, animal tracks, and geological formations that held significance in Yurok tradition. By evening of that first day, they had climbed high enough that the desert heat of the canyon country had given way to the crisp coolness of true mountain wilderness. Firewolf built their camp beside a stream that sang its way down through moss-covered boulders, its voice joining with the night sounds of owls and coyotes to create a symphony that seemed designed to wash away the harsh memories of civilization and its discontents. As they shared a dinner of trout caught with Firewolf's bare hands and roasted over coals fragrant with juniper wood, Sarah realized that she had not thought about Copper Ridge or its inhabitants for hours at a time. A freedom she had not experienced since the accusations against her first began. The mountains have a way of putting human troubles into proper perspective, Firewolf observed, as they watched stars emerge in impossible numbers overhead, undimmed by any artificial light for hundreds of miles in any direction. What seems overwhelming at ground level becomes manageable when viewed from sufficient height, and what appears permanent from one angle reveals itself as temporary when seen from another. This is why my people have always sought the high places when difficult decisions must be made or healing ceremonies must be performed. The second day brought challenges that tested not only Sarah's physical endurance, but her willingness to trust Firewolf's guidance even when his choices seemed to lead them into impossible situations. They followed a trail that appeared to end at the edge of a precipice, only to discover a narrow ledge that curved around the cliff face to reveal a hidden valley beyond. They crossed streams on logs so slippery with moss that one false step would have meant a deadly fall. Yet Firewolf's calm confidence enabled Sarah to navigate obstacles that would have terrified her under normal circumstances. More significantly, Firewolf began teaching her the Yurok language during their hours of walking, explaining that true understanding between peoples required more than simple translation of words. It demanded comprehension of the different ways that languages shaped thought itself. The Yurok tongue, he explained, contained concepts for which no English equivalents existed, particularly regarding the relationships between humans, nature, and the spiritual forces that govern both. Learning to think in these new patterns was essential preparation for her future role as a bridge between cultures. In English, you speak of owning land, as if earth were something that could be possessed like a tool or a garment, Firewolf said as they paused to rest beside a grove of ancient oak trees, whose massive trunks suggested they had been growing since before humans first walked these mountains. But in Yurok, we have no word for such ownership, only terms that describe our relationships with places, our responsibilities toward them, and the ways they nurture or challenge us. This difference in language reflects a fundamental difference in understanding what it means to be human in a world of other living beings. The third day brought them into country so remote that Firewolf admitted even his people rarely ventured there, except on vision quests or other sacred journeys. The landscape became increasingly surreal, filled with rock formations carved by wind and water into shapes that resembled sleeping giants, ancient temples, and mythical beasts frozen in stone. Hot springs bubbled up from underground sources, creating pockets of tropical warmth surrounded by snow-capped peaks that had never known the touch of summer heat. In this otherworldly environment, Sarah began experiencing visions and dreams that seemed to come from sources beyond her own mind. The visions began as fleeting images that appeared at the edges of her perception, glimpses of people and places she had never seen but somehow recognized. As the day progressed and they climbed higher into the rarefied atmosphere of the true wilderness, these fragmentary impressions began coalescing into coherent scenes that played out before her inner eye, with the vividness of actual memories. She saw herself standing before groups of both white settlers and indigenous peoples, speaking words that somehow bridged the gaps in understanding that had previously seemed unbridgeable. The visions come more strongly as you approach our sacred places, Firewolf explained when Sarah described what she was experiencing. The spirits of the ancestors gather most thickly in certain locations, and they sometimes share glimpses of possible futures with those whose work will help determine which possibilities become reality. What you are seeing represents not fixed destiny, but potential pathways that your choices and actions may help to manifest, Firewolf then shared his own visionary experiences from his youth, describing the ceremony during which he had received his adult name and learned of his calling. As a healer and peacemaker, the ritual had required him to spend 4 days and nights alone in a cave high on the sacred mountain, fasting and praying until the barriers between ordinary consciousness and spiritual awareness dissolved completely. During that time, he had experienced visions of future conflicts between his people and the encroaching white settlers, but also glimpses of a different possible future in which understanding and cooperation replaced fear and violence. The most important vision showed me a woman marked by fire who would appear when the need for healing became most desperate. Firewolf revealed as they made camp beside a lake so clear that the reflection of surrounding peaks created the illusion of mountains growing both above and below the water's surface. I saw her cast down by her own people, but rescued by serpents who served not evil but balance, and I knew that finding and protecting her would be one of my most important life tasks. When I first saw you in that canyon, I recognized immediately the woman from my visions, though you appeared more broken than I had expected. The revelation that Firewolf had been specifically called to rescue her through prophetic visions, received decades earlier, filled Sarah with a profound sense of purpose that transcended anything she had previously experienced. The random suffering that had defined her recent existence suddenly revealed itself as part of a larger pattern, a cosmic choreography designed to bring together the precise combination of people and circumstances necessary to prevent catastrophic bloodshed between two cultures balanced on the knife's edge of war. On the 4th day of their journey, they finally crested the final ridge and looked down into the valley where Firewolf's people made their permanent home. The village was unlike anything Sarah had imagined, consisting not of the primitive bark huts and crude shelters that white settlers typically associated with indigenous dwellings, but of beautifully crafted buildings that seemed to grow naturally from the landscape around them. Smoke rose from cooking fires, tended by women whose clothing displayed intricate beadwork and weaving that rivaled anything produced in the finest European workshops. My people have lived in this valley for more than 1,000 years, Firewolf explained with obvious pride as they began their descent toward the settlement. We have learned to work with the natural forces of this place rather than trying to dominate them, and the result is a way of life that sustains itself without depleting the resources that future generations will need. This is one of the lessons you will need to teach the white settlers, that true prosperity comes from cooperation with natural systems rather than their destruction. As they approached the village, Sarah became increasingly nervous about the reception she would receive from Firewolf's people. Despite his assurances that she would be welcomed, her recent experiences with rejection and persecution made it difficult to imagine any community accepting her without reservation. The scars that marked her face seemed to burn with renewed intensity as curious faces appeared in doorways and along the paths between buildings, all turning to observe the strange white woman who accompanied their returning hunter. But her fears proved groundless. The first person to approach them was an elderly woman whose own face bore the ritual scarification that marked her status as a tribal elder and spiritual leader. Instead of recoiling from Sarah's disfigurement, the old woman studied her scars with obvious interest and approval, nodding as if she recognized their significance. When she finally spoke, her words were in the Yurok language, but Firewolf translated them with visible emotion. She says that the spirits told her in dreams to prepare a place for the fire-marked woman who would come to learn the old ways of healing, Firewolf explained, his voice thick with feelings he rarely allowed to show. Utanai Itanostit. She has been gathering medicines and preparing teaching materials for weeks, waiting for your arrival. Her name is Singing Water, and she is the most respected healer in our entire nation. She will be your primary teacher during your time among us." Singing Water approached Sarah with the deliberate movements of one accustomed to dealing with wounded creatures, her weathered hands extended in a gesture of welcome that conveyed both respect and compassion. When she touched Sarah's scarred cheek with fingers gentled by decades of healing work, Sarah felt something deep within her spirit begin to unfold, like a flower that had been closed against winter cold, but now sensed the return of spring warmth. This formal welcome ceremony that followed involved the entire village gathering in a circle around a central fire that had been burning continuously for longer than anyone could remember. Singing Water spoke at length in the musical cadences of the Yurok language, her words punctuated by responses from the assembled crowd that suggested she was recounting prophecies and ancient stories that gave context to Sarah's arrival. Though Sarah understood only fragments of what was being said, she could feel the weight of expectation and hope in the voices around her. Firewolf provided whispered translation of the most significant portions of Singing Water's speech, explaining that the elder was telling the traditional story of the wounded healer who would come from the world of the settlers to learn indigenous ways of spiritual medicine. According to the prophecy, this figure would initially be rejected by her birth people because of visible marks that they would misinterpret as signs of corruption. But these same marks would identify her to the indigenous peoples as someone chosen for sacred work. Singing Water is explaining that your scars are not random injuries, but sacred tattoos applied by the spirits themselves during the fire that tested your courage. Firewolf translated as the old woman gestured towards Sarah's face with obvious reverence. She says the patterns match ancient symbols associated with the healing of divisions between peoples, and that your arrival marks the beginning of a new chapter in the relationship between our nations. The ceremony we are conducting now officially adopts you into our tribe as a daughter of the people, with all the rights and responsibilities that such status entails. The adoption ritual involved several elements that would have seemed primitive, or even blasphemous to the Christian sensibilities of Copper Ridge, but which Sarah experienced as profoundly meaningful expressions of acceptance and belonging. Singing Water painted traditional designs on Sarah's face using pigments made from local clays and plant materials, the patterns carefully chosen to complement and honor her existing scars rather than hiding them. Firewolf added eagle feathers to her hair and draped her shoulders with a beautifully woven blanket that had belonged to his deceased wife, explaining that Bright Star had specifically requested that it be given to the fire-marked woman when she arrived. The final element of the ceremony involved Sarah being given a new name in the Yurok language that would replace her English identity during her time among the people. After consultation with several other elders, Singing Water announced that she would be known as Scar Who Heals, a name that transformed what had been marks of shame in white society into badges of honor that announced her special calling to anyone familiar with indigenous traditions. As the formal ceremonies concluded and the evening feast began, Sarah found herself surrounded by people eager to hear her story and share their own experiences with the complex relationship between indigenous and settler communities. Many of the tribal members had encountered white people in various contexts, as traders, missionaries, government officials, and occasionally as neighbors attempting to establish peaceful coexistence. Their perspectives on these interactions were nuanced and varied, reflecting a sophisticated understanding of the political and cultural forces driving the ongoing conflicts. We do not hate the white people as a group, though some individuals among them have certainly earned our enmity through their actions, explained a middle-aged man named Grey Hawk, who served as one of the village's diplomatic representatives in dealings with territorial authorities. We understand that most of them are driven by the same basic needs that motivate all humans, the desire for safety, prosperity, and a secure future for their children. The problem arises when they pursue these legitimate goals through methods that unnecessarily harm others. The conversations that continued late into the night opened Sarah's eyes to perspectives on the settler-indigenous conflict that she had never encountered during her life in Copper Ridge. Instead of viewing white expansion as an inevitable tide that would eventually overwhelm all indigenous resistance, Firewolf's people saw the current tensions as a temporary crisis that could be resolved through proper application of diplomatic skills and mutual understanding. They had successfully negotiated peaceful coexistence agreements with several smaller settler communities, and they believed these models could be scaled up to address larger territorial disputes. The key insight that most white leaders fail to grasp is that indigenous peoples are not seeking to prevent all settlement or development, Greyhawk continued, as the fire burned lower and the conversation grew more intimate. We are seeking assurance that such activities will be conducted in ways that preserve the long-term health of the land and respect the rights of existing inhabitants. This is not an unreasonable request, but it requires a fundamental shift in thinking from domination-based approaches to cooperation-based solutions. As Sarah listened to these discussions, she began to understand how her own experiences of persecution and exile had prepared her to serve as an effective intermediary between two communities that had lost the ability to communicate productively. Her intimate knowledge of how fear and misunderstanding could transform ordinary people into dangerous mobs would help her recognize the warning signs of approaching violence, while her newfound understanding of indigenous values and perspectives would enable her to propose alternatives that addressed the legitimate concerns of both sides. When the evening finally ended and Firewolf showed her to the dwelling that had been prepared for her use, Sarah realized that she had not thought of herself as Seraphina Fairfax for hours at a time. The woman who had been cast into Rattlesnake Canyon to die had been replaced by someone whose identity was defined not by past suffering, but by future purpose. Tomorrow would begin her formal training in the healing arts that would prepare her for the work ahead, but tonight she fell asleep knowing that she had finally found her true home among people who valued her scars as signs of strength rather than marks of shame. 6 months had passed since Sarah's adoption into the Yurok tribe, and the transformation that had taken place during that time was nothing short of miraculous. Under Singing Water's patient tutelage, she had mastered not only the traditional healing arts of the indigenous peoples, but had also developed her own unique approach that combined Yurok wisdom with insights gained from her experiences in white society. Her reputation as a healer had spread throughout the mountain communities, drawing visitors from tribes hundreds of miles away who sought treatment for ailments that had proven resistant to conventional remedies. The woman who now answered to the name Scar Who Heals bore little resemblance to the broken bride who had been cast into Rattlesnake Canyon to die. Her scarred face had become a symbol of hope rather than fear, and her confident bearing spoke of someone who had found her true purpose in life. The traditional Yurok clothing she wore daily was adorned with beadwork that told the story of her journey from persecution to empowerment, and the sacred tattoos that Singing Water had added to complement her fire scars created an intricate pattern that identified her to any indigenous person as a master healer and bridge builder between worlds. But on this particular autumn morning, as golden leaves drifted down from the aspen groves that surrounded the village and the first snow of the season dusted the highest peaks, Firewolf brought news that would test everything she had learned. During her time among his people, a messenger had arrived during the night with word that violence had finally erupted between the white settlers and several indigenous tribes in the territories south of the Yurok lands. 3 homestead families had been killed in raids, and territorial militia units were preparing massive retaliation that would likely result in the deaths of hundreds of innocent people on both sides. The pattern you have studied is repeating itself, Firewolf explained, as they walked together beside the stream where trout still rose to snatch insects despite the approaching winter. Fear breeds atrocity. Atrocity justifies revenge, and revenge creates new fears that demand even greater violence. Unless someone intervenes to break this cycle, the bloodshed will spread northward until it reaches even our remote valley. The time has come for you to fulfill the purpose for which the spirits prepared you through all your trials and training. The prospect of leaving the safety and acceptance she had found among the Yurok people to venture back into the world that had rejected her so brutally filled Sarah with conflicting emotions. Part of her wanted to remain in the mountain sanctuary where her scars were honored and her abilities were valued, where she could continue learning from singing water and developing her healing skills in an environment free from the prejudice and superstition that had nearly destroyed her. But she also understood that her comfortable exile was a luxury she could not afford, while innocent people died in conflicts that her unique position might help to resolve. "I'm afraid they will not listen to me," Sarah admitted as they paused, beside a waterfall whose mist created rainbows in the morning sunlight. "The people of Copper Ridge made their opinion of me quite clear when they threw me into that canyon. What makes you think other white communities will react differently? To a woman they will see as having gone native and abandoned her own kind?" The question reflected not just practical concerns, but deeper fears about whether she had truly overcome the psychological damage inflicted by her persecution. Firewolf's response revealed the depth of his understanding regarding both human nature and the strategic elements of effective peacemaking. He explained that her previous rejection by white society, while traumatic at the time, had actually positioned her perfectly to serve as a credible advocate for indigenous peoples. Her intimate knowledge of white fears and motivations, combined with her obvious commitment to indigenous values, would make her uniquely qualified to address the concerns of both sides in ways that neither white nor indigenous negotiators could manage alone. More importantly, you will not be returning as the same woman who was cast down into the serpent's den, Firewolf continued, his voice carrying the authority of prophecy fulfilled. "Aji, you will return as Scar who heals, a master of the healing arts whose reputation has begun to spread even among the white settlements. Word of your abilities has traveled along the trading routes and military supply lines, and there are already stories being told about the miraculous cures you have achieved. Fear may have driven them to reject Serafina Fairfax, but desperation will compel them to welcome the healer who can save their children from diseases that white medicine cannot touch." The strategy Firewolf outlined was both elegant and psychologically sophisticated. Rather than attempting to return to Copper Ridge immediately, where bitter memories and entrenched hostilities would make productive dialogue almost impossible, Sarah would begin her mission in neutral territory, where her reputation as a healer could open doors that would remain closed to any overtly political approach. Several white communities closer to the current conflict zone had already sent requests for her assistance, having heard exaggerated but essentially accurate accounts of her success in treating conditions that had baffled their own physicians. "We will travel together to Fort Morrison, where territorial officials are currently attempting to coordinate their response to the raids," Firewolf explained as they made their way back toward the village to begin preparations for the journey ahead. "Your presence there will serve multiple purposes. You can provide medical assistance to wounded soldiers and civilians, demonstrate that indigenous peoples are capable of compassion even toward their enemies, and establish the credibility necessary for more complex diplomatic initiatives." Once people have witnessed your healing abilities firsthand, they will be more inclined to listen when you speak about the healing of larger wounds that divide communities and nations. Oh, the departure from the Yurok village 2 days later was marked by ceremonies that honored both the importance of Serra's mission and the dangers she would face in fulfilling it. Singing Water presented her with a medicine bundle containing herbs and ceremonial objects that would provide spiritual protection during her work among hostile populations, while other tribal members contributed items that would help establish her credibility as a legitimate healer rather than a charlatan or imposter. Most significantly, the tribal council formally appointed her as their official ambassador to the white settlements, giving her the authority to negotiate agreements on behalf of the Yurok nation. Firewolf would accompany her as far as Fort Morrison, serving as both protector and cultural interpreter, but the most dangerous part of her mission would require her to operate alone among people who had every reason to distrust both her motives and her methods. The weight of responsibility for preventing a regional war that could claim thousands of lives settled on her shoulders like a mantle made of lead. But she also felt a quiet confidence that came from knowing she had been prepared for this moment. By forces greater than human understanding, the journey to Fort Morrison took them through territory that showed increasing signs of the violence that had prompted their mission. Burned homesteads stood as stark reminders of recent raids, while heavily armed patrols of territorial militia demonstrated the military response that threatened to escalate the conflict beyond any possibility of peaceful resolution. At several points during their travel, they were stopped and questioned by suspicious soldiers who seemed torn between viewing Firewolf as a potential threat and recognizing Serra as a white woman whose presence suggested she was not traveling as a captive. "The situation is worse than our intelligence indicated," Firewolf observed as they made camp on their final night before reaching the fort. "The militias are operating almost independently of territorial authority, and their leaders seem more interested in punitive expeditions than in restoring genuine peace. Your work will be even more challenging than we anticipated, requiring you to address not just the fears of ordinary settlers, but the ambitions of military commanders who may profit from continued conflict." Fort Morrison, when they finally reached it after 5 days of hard travel, proved to be a scene of barely controlled chaos. Wounded soldiers filled the medical facilities beyond capacity, while civilian refugees from attacked homesteads crowded into temporary shelters that were already inadequate for approaching winter weather. The smell of blood, infection, and unwashed bodies hung over the entire compound like a miasma, and the faces of everyone they encountered reflected the kind of desperate exhaustion that comes from prolonged exposure to violence and uncertainty. Serra's arrival at the fort created an immediate sensation that spread through the military community faster than any official announcement could have managed. Within hours of her appearance at the main gates, stories were circulating about the miraculous healer who had learned indigenous medicine during her captivity and could cure ailments that had stumped army physicians. The tales grew more elaborate, with each telling, but they all contained the essential truth that would provide her with access to the military and civilian leadership. She possessed healing abilities that were desperately needed in a situation where conventional medicine had proven inadequate. Her first test came when the fort's chief medical officer, a harried army surgeon named Dr. Marcus Webb, reluctantly agreed to let her examine several patients whose conditions had not responded to standard treatments. Among these was a young militiaman named Johnny Patterson, whose infected leg wound had resisted all attempts at healing and was threatening to require amputation. Using techniques learned from Singing Water, Serra was able to draw out the infection and promote rapid healing that astonished everyone who witnessed it. "I don't understand how you did that," Dr. Webb admitted, as he examined Johnny's leg 3 days after Sarah's treatment began. The wound that I was preparing to amputate is showing more improvement than I've seen in 20 years of military medicine. Whatever methods you learned during your time with the Indians appear to be remarkably effective, and I would be grateful if you could teach me some of your techniques. His willingness to learn from indigenous healing practices represented exactly the kind of attitude change that Sarah hoped to encourage throughout the white community. Word of Johnny Patterson's dramatic recovery spread beyond the fort into the surrounding civilian settlements, bringing a steady stream of patients seeking treatment for conditions ranging from childhood diseases to chronic ailments that had plagued families for years. Each successful healing enhanced Sarah's reputation and credibility, creating opportunities for her to engage in the kinds of conversations about indigenous peoples and their capabilities that would have been impossible without the foundation of trust established through her medical work. But her most significant breakthrough came when she was asked to treat Colonel James Hartford, the territorial commander whose decisions would largely determine whether the current conflict escalated into full-scale war or was resolved through negotiation. Hartford had been suffering from severe headaches and episodes of blurred vision that interfered with his ability to command effectively, symptoms that army physicians had been unable to diagnose or treat successfully. Sarah recognized Hartford's condition as the result of accumulated stress and emotional trauma, ailments that Yurok healing traditions addressed through ceremonies designed to restore spiritual balance rather than simply treating physical symptoms. Working carefully to avoid triggering the colonel's suspicions about indigenous superstitions, she began treating him with herbal remedies that addressed both the physical manifestations of his stress and its underlying psychological causes. Miss Fairfax, I must admit that your treatments have provided more relief than anything the army doctors attempted, Hartford confided during one of their sessions, his voice carrying a note of wonder that suggested he was beginning to question some of his previous assumptions about indigenous capabilities. I find myself curious about the people who taught you these methods. Perhaps they possess knowledge that we have been too quick to dismiss as primitive nonsense. The opening was exactly what Sarah had been hoping for. Over the course of several weeks, as Hartford's condition continued to improve under her care, Sarah was able to engage him in increasingly substantive conversations about the root causes of the current conflict and possible alternatives to the military solutions that his subordinates were advocating. She shared insights gained from her time among the Yurok about indigenous perspectives on land use, resource management, and diplomatic protocols that could provide frameworks for peaceful coexistence if both sides were willing to approach negotiations with good faith. What you're describing sounds almost too reasonable to be true, Hartford admitted after Sarah had outlined a comprehensive peace plan based on successful agreements between the Yurok and several smaller white communities. But I've seen enough of your healing abilities to know that you possess knowledge and skills that exceed anything in my previous experience. If your people's diplomatic methods are as sophisticated as their medical techniques, perhaps we should give them serious consideration before resorting to solutions that will inevitably cost many lives on both sides. The breakthrough moment came when Hartford agreed to meet with Firewolf as an official representative of indigenous interests in the region. A meeting that would have been unthinkable without the foundation of trust that Sarah had established through her healing work. The session, conducted in Hartford's private quarters with only Sarah present as translator and cultural interpreter, marked the first time in the territory's history that a senior military commander had engaged in formal diplomatic dialogue with indigenous leadership on terms of mutual respect. Firewolf's presentation combined practical proposals for resolving specific territorial disputes with broader philosophical frameworks for understanding the relationship between human communities and the natural environment they shared. His eloquence and obvious intelligence impressed Hartford, who had been expecting to encounter either a primitive savage or a crafty negotiator seeking to deceive white authorities through false promises of peace. Your friend speaks with more wisdom and sophistication than most of the politicians I deal with in the territorial capital, Hartford confided to Sarah after Firewolf had departed to return to his mountain village. If other indigenous leaders possess similar capabilities, then we have been seriously underestimating the people we're fighting. Perhaps it's time to explore whether our conflicts stem from misunderstanding rather than fundamental incompatibility of interests. Within 2 months of Sarah's arrival at Fort Morrison, the dynamic of the entire regional conflict had begun to shift in directions that no one could have predicted when the crisis first erupted. Her medical work had established her credibility among white settlers and military personnel, while her diplomatic efforts had opened channels of communication that enabled both sides to begin addressing their concerns through negotiation rather than violence. Small agreements regarding water rights and grazing boundaries provided models for larger territorial settlements, and the success of these initial compacts encouraged other communities to seek similar peaceful resolutions. The woman who had once been thrown into Rattlesnake Canyon as a suspected witch had returned to the white world as an agent of healing whose very existence proved that the barriers between different peoples were not as insurmountable as fear and prejudice had made them seem. Her scars, once viewed as marks of supernatural corruption, were now recognized by those who knew her story as symbols of the courage required to build bridges across seemingly unbridgeable divides. When news finally reached Copper Ridge that their former resident had not only survived her ordeal, but had become a renowned healer whose diplomatic efforts were helping to prevent a regional war, the reaction among the townspeople was a mixture of shame, amazement, and grudging respect. Judge Whitmore, the man who had presided over her condemnation and banishment, was among the first to publicly acknowledge that they had made a terrible error in their treatment of someone who had possessed the potential to benefit their entire community. But Sarah never returned to Copper Ridge, having found her true home among people who valued her unique combination of cultural knowledge and healing abilities. Her work as a bridge builder between indigenous and settler communities continued for decades, preventing countless conflicts and establishing precedents for peaceful coexistence that would influence territorial policy long after her own lifetime. The serpents of Rattlesnake Canyon had failed to claim their intended victim, and in doing so had inadvertently unleashed a force for healing that would transform an entire region's approach to the challenges of cultural diversity and mutual respect. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.